The title of the most violent man in history is not an easy one to assign. Many could qualify for this grim label. There's Peter Kürten, the vampire of Dusseldorf, who descended into utter insanity and became convinced that he needed to consume human blood in order to survive. He drank his victims' blood after murdering them in an unspeakably savage frenzy of stabbing and strangulation. Then there's Dean Corll, the Candyman, who lured teenage boys to his home, only to tie them to a torture board where they were sodomized, electrocuted, and ultimately strangled or shot. Not to forget Robert Maudsley, who would crack his victims' skulls wide open and allegedly eat their brains. Their methods were undeniably brutal. Mutilations, cannibalism, unimaginable torture, but none seemed to have matched the sheer, relentless violence of Luis Garavito. Known as the Beast, Garavito didn't just kill, he hunted, tortured, and desecrated his victims with a cruelty that defies comprehension. Over 200 young boys brutally raped and tortured, their bodies left mutilated, often missing their genitals, buried in mass graves across Colombia. His reign of terror spanned years, tearing apart countless lives. What Garavito did to those children wasn't just murder, it was the systematic destruction of their innocence in the most horrifying way imaginable. The scale of his brutality and methodical sadism that he employed make Garavito perhaps the most fitting candidate for the most violent man in history. I'm MrBizzare, and welcome back to the channel where we explore the most disturbing and unsettling tales from around the world. Make sure to subscribe for more bizarre videos, and just a warning, exactly like the last one, this story is going to be graphic. Born on January 25th, 1957, Luis Alfredo Garavito entered a world filled with cruelty and violence. His birthplace was a small, quiet town in Colombia, but within the walls of his home there was nothing but brutality. The eldest of 7 children, Garavito had no chance to experience the innocence of childhood. His father, Manuel Garavito, a vicious alcoholic, ruled the household with fists and fury. Manuel would not only physically beat his children, but his cruelty also extended into twisted realms of sexual violence, preying on both his children and his wife, Rosa. From a young age, Luis's innocent mind was twisted and disturbed by the grotesque abuse of his father, who showed no love, only hatred and violence. His earliest memories were filled with pain, degradation, and fear. Manuel would force his son to share his bed, where he would violently assault him. But the abuse didn't stop there. Friends of Manuel, equally depraved, saw Luis as nothing more than just another body to violate. When Manuel wasn't violating his son, his friends would take over, forcing the young boy into a perpetual state of terror and helplessness. These men also derived sick pleasure from torturing young Luis, causing severe damage to his genitals. By the time he was just 12 years old, Luis had already endured more suffering than most people could imagine in an entire lifetime. The abuse Luis experienced at home was mirrored by the torment he faced at school. He was ridiculed and bullied relentlessly, an easy target for classmates who could sense his vulnerability. His shy, reserved demeanor only invited cruelty, while the teachers, figures of authority who should have protected him, did nothing to stop it. The school, much like his home, became a place of torment where nowhere was safe for him. The relentless bullying and isolation, no doubt, pushed him further into darkness, fueling his hatred and rage that would later consume him. By the time he reached his teenage years in the 1970s, Luis had already begun showing the disturbing signs of a damaged mind, foreshadowing his future depravity. He drifted from job to job, unable to hold down stable employment due to violent outbursts and growing psychological instability. He became a heavy drinker and began experiencing bouts of paranoia, psychosis, and deep depression. It was during this period that Garavito's sexual deviance began to fully emerge. What started as twisted fantasies quickly turned into reality. He began children, targeting both boys and girls. At first, his assaults were opportunistic, but soon they became more calculated, more violent. Luis had finally lost complete control of his damaged mind. He sought out children to satisfy his growing hunger for domination, using manipulation and charm to lure them in. By the end of his teenage years, Garavito had firmly stepped onto the path that would eventually lead him to become the Beast. The shy, abused boy was gone, replaced by a man whose only function seemed to be causing pain. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, Luis Garavito's violent urges grew increasingly severe, yet he still managed to evade societal detection. He drifted through relationships with various women, but all would quickly fail because of his uncontrollable temper and violent fantasies. During this period, realizing that his mind was damaged beyond repair and that there was no chance of him ever leading a normal life, Luis attempted to end his own life, but this attempt failed. By the early 1990s, Garavito had abandoned all pretense of fitting into society. The monster that had been festering inside him finally broke free, and what followed was a reign of terror unlike any Colombia had ever seen. Between 1992 and 1999, Garavito began systematically targeting homeless and vulnerable boys, exploiting their desperate circumstances to satisfy his perverse cravings. His victims were primarily boys between the ages of 6 and 16, children who had fallen through the cracks of society, rendered invisible by poverty, conflict, and neglect. Garavito saw them as easy prey, knowing that no one would notice their absence, and he began to hunt them. He used a variety of disguises to blend into the communities where he sought his victims. Sometimes he would dress as a priest, other times as a farmer or an elderly man, creating an illusion of safety that allowed him to lure boys into his clutches. He offered them small gifts or promised them work, exploiting their vulnerability and need for trust. Once he had gained their confidence, Garavito would lead them on long walks through desolate areas, deliberately tiring and dehydrating them. The children, already malnourished and weak, would be exhausted by the time Garavito chose to strike, and this made their wills so much easier to break. What came next was nothing short of horrific. Garavito would violently attack the boys before binding their wrists so they could not resist, and then he would unleash a level of sadistic cruelty that defies comprehension. His victims were subjected to hours of unspeakable torture. He would beat them, sometimes with sticks or rocks, while they were tied up, relishing in the fear and pain he inflicted. He sought not just to break their bodies, but also their spirits and their will to live. The torture didn't end there. Garavito would assault the boys, raping them while they were bound and helpless. Many of his victims were repeatedly. He inflicted physical trauma that left the children mutilated, their genitals often severely injured. The agony his victims experienced was unimaginable. For Garavito, this was the ultimate expression of control and domination, reducing these boys to nothing more than objects of his sadistic desires. In many cases, Garavito would continue to mutilate the bodies of his victims well after killing them. He dismembered some of them, cutting off their limbs or even genitals in a final act of desecration. The corpses were then dumped in shallow graves, discarded like trash. Garavito killed with the same methodical precision every time, leaving behind grotesquely mutilated bodies that bore the signs of his horrific rituals. For 7 terrifying years, Garavito carried out this nightmare across 13 municipalities in Colombia, leaving a trail of devastation in his wake. In the end, it wasn't Garavito's conscience that stopped him, it was sheer luck. In 1997, authorities discovered a mass grave in a rural area near the town of Pereira, containing the remains of over 36 boys. The scene was beyond gruesome, decomposed bodies piled together. The stench of death permeated the air, the shallow graves barely able to conceal the scale of the slaughter. Bound wrists, shattered bones, and mutilated genitals told the story of the suffering these children endured before their final agonizing moments. Though it would take another 2 years to capture Garavito, the discovery of the mass grave finally put authorities on his trail as they began to search for who was responsible. By 1999, the authorities had uncovered another mass grave, this time in Palmyra, where more bodies of young boys were discovered. Personal items were found at the scene, including a pair of glasses, brandy bottles, underwear, and shoes, all linked to Garavito. These items were among the many pieces of evidence that had been gradually closing in on him. Investigators had also recovered a receipt and a note from one of the scenes, which led them to Garavito's girlfriend at the time, Gracelia, and ultimately to a suitcase he had left in their care. Inside, they found detailed journals of his kills, names, dates, and descriptions of his atrocities meticulously recorded. The web began closing in on Luis. The reign of the Beast was nearing its end, but not before he tried to claim yet another victim. On a sweltering evening, Garavito was drinking heavily in the city of Villavicencio when he stumbled upon a 12-year-old boy who was selling lottery tickets. Introducing himself as a local politician, Garavito charmed the boy with promises of work and easy money. Pretending to hug the boy, he pulled him in close before revealing a concealed knife and threatening the terrified child into silence. He forced the boy into a taxi, and soon they were headed to a secluded, desolate area on the outskirts of the city. Garavito, methodical and cold-blooded as ever, led the boy to a barbed wire fence and forced him to climb it, injuring the boy. He'd carefully chosen this place for its privacy, where no one would hear the child's screams. Garavito screamed, "Am I a sadist?" as he taunted the boy, waving the blade in front of him while masturbating over the helpless child. But before Garavito could unleash the full extent of his violence, fate intervened. A homeless teenager had been nearby, heard the commotion, and, fueled by a mixture of fear and bravery, threw rocks at Garavito. Enraged, Garavito chased the teenager with his dagger, but the boy managed to escape. His victim, seizing the moment, also fled, both children racing to a nearby farmhouse for help. As the children alerted locals and authorities, Garavito became drunkenly lost in the woods. Disorientated from his heavy intoxication, he approached a 12-year-old girl and aggressively demanded directions. By the time police arrived, they found him emerging from the woods at around 7 p.m, looking disheveled and furious. He presented a fake ID, still claiming to be a local politician, but despite his protests, police already suspected that they had found the man responsible for the mass graves. Garavito initially denied everything. He continued to spin a web of lies, hoping to avoid the inevitable. But when police secretly obtained his DNA from his prison cell, it was a match to samples found on numerous victims. His interrogation lasted over 12 hours, during which detectives read aloud the horrifying details of his crimes. The pressure finally broke Garavito, and he confessed to the murders of about 140 boys, though investigators believed the number was closer to 200 victims across Colombia and Ecuador. In the end, Garavito was convicted of 138 murders, the largest confirmed body count of any serial killer in history. He was sentenced to 1,853 years in prison, the longest sentence in Colombian history. However, due to legal limits, his sentence was reduced to a mere 22 years for good behavior and for helping police locate some of the bodies. This, of course, caused much public outrage and controversy. Despite his monstrous actions, Garavito had the audacity to dream of a life after prison. He reportedly expressed a desire to become a Pentecostal pastor and marry a woman. He even fantasized about entering politics, believing that he could help abused children. The hypocrisy was staggering, as this was a man who had slaughtered innocent children on an unimaginable scale. Garavito spent his remaining days in a maximum security prison, separated from the general population for his own safety. Blind from severe eye cancer and weakened by leukemia, he continued to degrade in body and mind until his death in October 2023, finally succumbing to his diseases. Luis left behind a grim legacy as arguably the most violent, twisted individual in modern history, destroying hundreds of innocent young lives. So that's it for tonight's bizarre video. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on future videos. Thanks for watching, and good night.